Okay, good morning, everyone. It's great to see this group. Some great conversations started yesterday and at breakfast, and I think we're going to have more exciting, inspirational thoughts, questions, conversation today. My name is Judy Sharkey. I'm from the University of New Hampshire, and currently I'm the chair of the Research Professional Council in TESOL. So some of the conversations yesterday about research agendas, research priorities, and then really talking to people afterwards about what's important in your context, what's happening, what should we be thinking about as an organization and as professionals, as a community who, that collaborate across our different activities is very exciting. So, and I'm looking forward to more of those conversations today. The session this morning, you can see from the title, is trying to understand the relationship between research questions and methodologies. And we have a really exciting panel. Ester de Jong, Maricel Santos, Thor Sawin are all here, and they're all going to talk about particular projects. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So here are some guiding questions for us, and keep these in mind as you listen to our panelists. Right? What is the relationship between questions and methods? How and where do researchers begin this process? And how do those two things, questions and methodologies, interact over time? And what kinds of decisions do researchers and practitioners have to make as they proceed in their projects? And how do the decisions limit and or benefit the inquiry and its findings? So think about these as we're going through this morning's session. So this is what we're going to do. Each of our panelists is going to have about 15 minutes to talk about their work on these particular topics. And there's a lot of great slides in this presentation, but as we mentioned yesterday, you don't have to feel obligated to keep really detailed notes because they're going to be publicly available after the symposium. So one of the things, again, as we're trying to keep in mind, this relationship, the dialogue between questions and methods. One of the things that some folks find useful is this tool. It's called the data planning matrix. And it's really, we found it helpful for teachers, for graduate students, for novice researchers, and even experienced researchers to keep in mind how we think about a larger issue or problem, and then how we start to plan out, well, what are the different sub-questions that we need to follow, and then what kinds of methods are going to help address these questions. And again, always trying to keep in mind that it is the questions, it is the issues, it is the puzzles of practice that drive us, right? Sometimes novice researchers, we want to jump ahead to, I'm going to do ethnography. Well, what's the issue? I don't know, but I know I want to do ethnography, right? So how do we not fall in love with the methods and really think about the purpose of research for many of us, we're trying to address a social issue, right? We're trying to create change. We're not necessarily trying to come up with a new way of surveying large numbers of people, even though that's very useful and that will be helpful. But we have to think about, especially for teachers, right, and practitioners, we're thinking about really what's going on in our local context, what are those issues and problems that are driving us, and then how can we develop sophisticated ways of inquiry and investigation. Okay. So here's another question please keep in mind as we're talking about this question methods area. What is the role of sticking to the script, right? So Robert Stake says, too much emphasis on original research questions and contexts can distract researchers from recognizing new issues when they emerge. But too little emphasis on research questions can leave researchers unprepared for the subtle evidence supporting the most important relationships. So think about your own experiences and processes with questions and implementation. Okay, so wow, that's a lot to think about. Yeah, you guys are going to be busy. So with all that, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Ester de Jong.
Do I have to turn this one off? No, we're good. Well, welcome everybody. You're thinking hard. I have to say the project I'm going to be talking to you about had a lot of elements of shifting research questions as we were doing this particular project. So I'm going to talk to you about Project Delta. This was a federally funded research grant that was quite unique in its setup. Most of the OELA grants are national professional development grants, so a lot of people do professional development, curriculum development. But we made the argument that we already had the curriculum in place. And so what we were interested in was what happens to our graduates after they finish the program and how are they doing. A little bit of context to this, because I'm going to be making references to the context in Florida that might be helpful for you to understand. So Florida has a very strong framework for mainstream teacher preparation for working with English language learners. And so the program that we have for them is called an ESOL-infused program. And the reason is that they take 2 standalone ESOL courses taught by ESOL faculty, but then the other teacher preparation standards are all infused in other general education classes. So we're kind of unique in that. It's a mandate. They all need to graduate with this ESOL endorsement that they get through this particular model. So the mandate for that started in 2001. By the time we wrote this grant, I think it was 2008 or 7. And we knew nothing about whether this model was actually effective or not. So that's where we started. It's like, we know we're doing this, we know it's a mandate. More and more people are talking about mainstream teacher preparation. Is this actually effective? So that's where the question started. And as a post-training assessment is what we called it, we got funded. And we started the process of trying to answer that broad question. It's a mixed method study, which means that we looked both at quantitative and qualitative approaches to figuring things out. And I think that's really important to me. Like, kind of lesson number 1 is we often have these camps that say, you know, the quantitative do X and the qualitative do Y, and we're kind of fighting over paradigms. And I think one of the things that I really learned through this project, you know these things, but you really kind of understand it better, is you can address different kinds of questions with the methodologies that you pick. It's not better or worse, it's just different things that you can learn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through kind of 3 phases in the project that use different kinds of methodologies. And helped us kind of understand this notion of how effective are we in preparing mainstream teachers from different perspectives, and see if we can figure this out together. So the first research question was, does the program prepare our teachers to work with ELLs? And so we started actually with a very simple piece and said, well, let's survey our graduates then. Let's get their perspectives on whether they were prepared or not, right? And so we designed a survey that asks them essentially to indicate, did we prepare you in these areas? Now let me kind of show you a little bit of that survey. Did we prepare you in areas that from the literature we say are important for you to know as a teacher of English language learners? And how efficacious, is that how you say that? How efficacious do you feel in using those strategies or in these areas, right? We kind of wanted to get a sense of both of those pieces. Now notice that the original question was only about preparedness. So we're already adding a piece here because we realized, well, just saying that we prepared is not enough. We want to know whether they're actually going to be doing something. So we added already the efficacy piece. We also interviewed a number of them about the same questions. So did we prepare you well to work with second language learners? What did we do? What recommendations do you have for us to get better at it? So that allowed us to get our graduates' perspectives on whether we did a good job, right? We realized, however, that that's not really what the grant wanted us to look for. It was good information for us, great feedback for us as a program. We made changes as a result of that. But really what the grant people wanted to know is like, so these graduates are working with second language learners. Do they do a better job? Now, better, impact are those words that call for a very quantitative kind of design, right? So do ELLs taught by our program graduates do better academically? So that was our question number 2 that we had to still look at. For that, we started on a long journey. Remember the data matrix that we just showed? So the data matrix asks, where do you find the information? So we had to find a way of figuring out, so where are our graduates teaching? Are they working with English language learners? How can we find them, and how can we get access to the achievement of the English language learners? You'll laugh, it's like, yeah. Well, I tell you, in most states you can't even begin to research that question, but in Florida you can, because we have something called the Education Data Warehouse. And it's a maze. It's a very lengthy process to get access to the database to begin with, but okay, we did that. That took a long time, a lot of forms, but we got access to that database. But as you can imagine, a database full of teachers means you got to think about, how do you find your graduates? So we had to find out a list of our graduates, all of their, well, we could have their names, but we also have to have some kind of an identifying piece of information that allowed us to link our graduates into that database and say, okay, out of that entire database, here's our graduates. So we did that. We got that list. Then in that whole maze, the question becomes, how many of these teachers are actually working in Florida? How many are teaching English language learners? So we did, and we realized the database, of course, because it's actually looking at achievement data. Achievement data is not available at all grade levels. So we're already narrowing down. We could only look at 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and we were looking at reading and math scores. So we could ask that question. So do they do academically better? Became, how did they perform on the standardized achievement test in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade? And then the next question, of course, is, well, are they doing statistically better if they are our graduates, right, versus non-graduates? Well, here are some of the criteria that we had to sort through in terms of the database. Because who are the ELLs? The first one that we had to do was we had to take out, or we decided to take out, the students who were special needs students. Because we figured that's a special group that we would have to analyze separately. We also had to decide about retention. Because a retention ELL, a student who actually stays behind for a year or stays in the same grade for a year, gets either counted twice or doesn't get counted as a retention student if they go to a different teacher. So we took the retention students out. But then we had to have a complete record in terms of academic record. And one of the hardest things in the database was, how do you decide that you're actually looking at the mainstream teacher teaching the ELL versus the ESL teacher teaching the ELL? So we had to find a way that says this is actually the main teacher of record. And how do you decide whether there was an ESL teacher in the building too who was working with the ELL versus just the mainstream teacher? So actually there was a code in the database that indicated whether there was an ESOL program in the school. So we took that out as well. So you can see that even just looking at this big, huge database, which we were like, yeah, great. You had to make a lot of decisions to actually finally get to the data set that we could actually analyze. That was a really interesting process, and we created this big, huge decision-making tree to kind of keep track of all of that. So we did, and then we found out that as part of the non-program graduates, we actually could not distinguish them any further, because of course what we wanted to really know was graduates who graduated from a Florida program who did not get the endorsement. But the data that relates to what program you graduated for certification is housed in a different database that was not linked to the database that we're looking at. So it gets really complicated. So the only thing we could do in the end was, you know, our program graduates versus everybody else, And then we could compare internally, because actually our program graduates did different kinds of programs. So that gives you the sense, right, of what kind of decisions we had to make. So together, the survey and the interviews and the EDW data set really helped us say something about how prepared and did it make a difference, because we could take the quantitative results. What we realized was that only got us this far, and this is what quantitative research does. It gives you a pattern. It doesn't help you understand much why that pattern exists. So you need another line of research to do that. So we got a little bit of that through the interviews. So what we decided was, well, that really what we need to know is what practices do our graduates engage in? Because that will really tell us not only did we prepare them well, but are they using what we teach them in their classroom practices? So for that, we went to classroom observations. So we did case studies of about 6 teachers in different contexts. And we went in and we videotaped them during their math and their reading classes. They were working with ELLs in their classroom. And we said, we just want to really understand how you organize your classroom instruction to meet the needs of the ELLs in your classroom. So we did that in the course of about 18 months. We interviewed them about their practices and said, okay, tell us what you really do. So that allowed us to really get to a different kind of question. And probably one of the most important things that we learned through that is the importance of context. So our original question was about the impact of attending the program on ELL achievement, and we realized that that's just not a direct relationship. There's a lot that happens between students graduating from the program and their practices in the school. And one of the things that we realized is that school context made a huge difference in the kinds of practices that the teachers were engaged in. Kind of the degrees of freedom, if you will, that they had in order to implement what they knew were good practices. So in some cases, they had a lot of freedom to do that. In other cases, they had very little freedom to do that. In other cases, we also learned, and if you have read our article in TESOL Quarterly, is that they think about inclusion, but they're not always very good at inclusive practices. And part of that is one of our hypotheses, if you will, is related, we think, maybe to how many ELLs you actually have in your classroom and the proficiency of those ELLs in the classroom. So we're still thinking about how can we follow up with that. So I hope as you look at this is that you can see we have different research questions that shifted along the way a little bit because we had wanted to find out other kinds of things, but also how we, by combining the quantitative and the qualitative piece, we just found out different aspects of the question of how do we prepare teachers to work with second language learners. And to me, that was really the power of the project, is that we could do the quantitative kinds of questions, relationships between, but we also could get a good understanding of the qualitative, the practices part. Thank you.
Thanks, Ester. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear from all the panelists first and then have questions at the end, okay? So as we do our transition to our next speaker, if you might have a question or two you want to write down so you can ask Ester at the end. And I also wanted to mention that we have copies of that data planning matrix that we'll give to people at the end, and we might use them to facilitate some kinds of conversations during the breakout sessions, okay? Okay, so next we have Thor Sawin from Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Thanks.
Okay, should I use this one? Is it? No, turn it on. Or is it better to use that, I guess? This, okay. It's working. Welcome to our home here. We're glad that you're all here. I want to talk about this idea of a story. A lot of times I was intimidated by research. So I got a master's degree in TESOL and in linguistics at Michigan State University. And in my master's program, I tried to avoid doing research to what extent I could. It was a well enough designed program that I couldn't avoid it. But I did the non-thesis option and all these things because I was just like, research, I just want to like go out into the world and help people. Right? I don't want to be a researcher. But as I was teaching overseas for 6 years after I got my master's, I started to realize like, wow, you can actually really help people. And the one advice that I was given is to only do a PhD when there was like something about the world that you cared enough about, that you were excited about this idea of getting 4 years of your life to just answer a question, right? And it was like, you want that kind of question that will sustain you through 4 years of hoop jumping and all of those things. And I know not everyone needs to do it, but for me, I think that was the thing that reframed my thinking about research, is like, you're given a privilege that very few people in the world have, to get the time and the energy to answer a question that needs to be answered, and that maybe no one else will have the passion, the time, the energy, the resources to answer it. And so one of this project that I'm going to talk about today, it started actually from my dissertation research. I was interested, as I lived overseas, that there was a lot of people who had a huge desire to learn the language of the place that they were living, but very little outcomes of actually learning it. And I saw for different kinds of people as they were living overseas, carrying out different kinds of projects, that their lack of language proficiency actually really worked against them. And that they thought, I'm here to do this, I'm doing this thing, that's what people say, but they couldn't hear what people were saying about them behind their backs because they didn't know the language and how they were being made sense of. So I found this one organization I had some friends who worked for, and this organization was kind of famous for not being very good at language learning. And so my first question was this very vague one of just like, well, what's going on with this organization? Why aren't people who really, really want to learn the language and who can like move you to tears about how important learning the language is and how necessary it is, but why aren't they doing it? And so when I went and did my PhD, I was actually cautioned to do, or recommended to do an ethnography, because there were so many questions, there was so much, and I needed to get a handle on that. So I spent 3 years basically kind of living inside this organization, going all around the world, gathering lots of data, observations, taking photos, interviews at different people at all different kinds of stages. And so that was great, and that resulted in my 600-page dissertation, but that wasn't in a form that was extremely helpful, I think, to many people. I can't just say, go read the 600-page dissertation, you'll find it in there somewhere, the question that you're interested in. So as I was working with this organization to be responsible, they had some very specific questions, as did I, about, well, all of this, like I surfaced some things began to float to the top, but we needed to dig into that a little bit more detail. And so they wanted to do a survey. And I'm cautious here with my students about a survey, especially a qualitative survey. It seems like it's going to be the easiest way to gather data, but it's the hardest way. If I wanted to make my life easy, teaching in an MA TESOL program is like, all of you do a quantitative thing where you have two groups and you compare them together with statistical significance. That paper will write itself. I mean, you have to make sure that you're using the right statistics and stuff, but it's very easy. Getting survey responses and then trying to analyze what comes out of it is this cloud, this very vague cloud. So people gravitate toward it because it's easy to imagine, but it's really hard to get a handle on. So I want to talk a little bit about that process today. When do we want to look at qualitative data? I think whenever our question is how something works and not what. A lot of times we think, well, I want to prove that X is Y. So quantitative data can actually do that if you have a large enough data set. But qualitative can be like, yeah, but okay, if I prove that X is different than Y, but why is it that way? What is the experience of the typical person who shows that difference, or the atypical person? You can't do that unless you're getting qualitative data. How does this affect what's going on in the future? Okay, so I found out that two things are different, so what? What are the consequences of that? How did it get this way? What is the history? Why is there a difference? And how are these things actually discussed or understood or put into words? Very sort of more of like the discourse around that. So all of this is where we really want to gather qualitative data to try to answer our questions. If there's a lot of interrelated themes that you may want to be able to analyze together, knowing they affect each other, but also to analyze them separately, So themes like comparison, motivation, motherhood, accountability, self-regulation, all of these were things that came up in this kind of large data set. But if I wanted to be able to analyze each of these and what is the role that this plays, we think a lot of times of research as trying to come up with a truth. But one of the things I like about qualitative research is that you're telling a story. And so people in the hard sciences like, oh, a story isn't research. You know, a story isn't the truth, right? But I think a story is really in many ways the best kind of truth. It's that people can accept the truth, understand the truth in the form of a story that they can't in the form of a measure of statistical significance, right? And it's through getting the honor of hearing people's stories, I think that's really exciting, and using many people's experiences to tell a story about what's happening in the world. I also think this is really useful when the data are multimodal. So when you're getting data in a lot of different forms, a survey has its benefits and it also has a lot of drawbacks. When you ask people to mark X, Y, or Z, they have to choose X, Y, or Z, and you don't know how much they really felt that those were the right choices. Even if you give them a place, so tell me how you felt about that question, people try to write as little as they can on a survey. The goal of a survey is to get it done extremely fast, right? So sitting down with someone face to face, you get much better data, which can complement what you get in a survey. Actually following that person throughout their life and seeing what other people say and what they do is actually much better than that, taking pictures, reading policy documents, and so you end up, again, with this cloud of a lot of data which is in very different forms. And this is where qualitative analysis really helps you to answer these sorts of questions that if you want to say something about people's attitudes, you're going to need data from 5 different sources. Some are pictures of posters, some are interviews, some are surveys, what's on the official website, all of these things is going to be part of that. So here's some pictures that I took in my research of someone with Hungarian verb declensions in their kitchen so they could memorize them. You know, people doing Rosetta Stone in a 5-minute break at work, making flashcards, what are in the intro to Italian textbooks that these people were using, and actually doing a discourse analysis of those. So all of these things were the kinds of data that fed into answering my question. So, you know, you can give a survey response like this, and one of the things I was leery about giving a survey, because I knew that to do a survey quickly, which is what these people wanted to do, it's often like, choose A, B, C, D, or E. You know, are you 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? And that wasn't the kind of data that I wanted, but the stakeholders of the organization, that's the data that they needed. They needed to show quantitative numbers. They wanted to show statistics. But I spent a lot of time working back and forth and building this survey together with them so that the questions actually made sense and so that they could actually get the comments. And the advantage for me as a survey giver was because there was organizational buy-in, because even though I was sort of feeding them the ideas of what I wanted to ask, there was enough of what they wanted to ask and they were excited about it that they could actually make that part of the job description for their personnel. So we got 100% response on the survey because it was part of their job, right? Which is really useful, right, when you're giving a survey, because the problem is if you're just sending it out into the universe and you're hoping that 8 random people, 6 of whom are your grandma's cousins, you know, respond to the survey, it really affects this. So you really want to get institutional buy-in. So one piece of advice is that if you are going to develop a survey or questionnaire, have it not be from me as a researcher, but have it come from them so that everyone is excited about it and there's multiple stakeholders to ensure that it gets done well. So statistics can tell one kind of a story, like this: how was your motivation for language learning at the moment you arrived in country? It was like pretty good. How's your motivation changed since that time? And it was pretty much symmetrical of the people who got less motivated and the people who got more motivated. So we saw this real bifurcation. And this is an interesting story, right? But this doesn't really tell us very much. We have to zoom into the questions. And when we do, we see things like this. I'm more motivated, but also less motivated. And this is where a survey actually isn't going to help you very much because people are experiencing this kind of split self. I want to learn and I need to learn, but I have no time to learn. Parts of me are this, other parts of me are that. Right, so what this says is there's actually this bifurcated motivation. There's 2 different selves. There's 2 different I's that appear. There's the me that's really motivated and there's the me that's really unmotivated. And both of those are present in the same person. And just a survey isn't going to help me answer those kinds of questions or some kind of numerical data. This is where I need much more complex data and to do more complex data analysis. Numerical outliers can actually be the most important part of the story. So these are the people who've considered leaving the field because of language struggles. The vast majority said no, but the ones that say yes are actually probably the most interesting, right? And you don't want to say, oh, that's just a small portion. Yeah, but a lot of people have spent a lot of money training these people and sending these people, so we're interested in that small group, and that may be the most important. That may be the reason to do this research. So we get things like team dynamics, competition, passive learning. So, what kinds of learners connect demotivation and competition? What in the policies and practices contribute to competition? Passive learning, like, I wish I had just taken more classes. Well, that actually wasn't a good thing. It wouldn't have probably helped them having observed the classes that were on offer that they could have taken, right? But these are the kinds of questions that came up in the comments, and by having them be paid to take the survey by the organization, having the time, I could get the rich comments that I would have needed. And there's information that you don't ask about that's the main story maybe. So the role of English and the role of multilingualism, which I'm interested in. The organization itself didn't care about those. I did. And I was very happy to see these kind of comments just surface actually in the data set. So you may be surprised when you're doing qualitative data analysis that there's things that come up that you never asked. And this was sort of the slide we saw about research questions. You don't want to stray too far away from the research question or you'll stop looking for the things that might be important, but you need to be surprised and have your research question be loose enough that you can discover what I thought was the problem, even in an organization that I lived in and day out for 3 years. There was actually something else that was going on that I wanted to explore. So the data sets can be huge. I had 193 who completed it, the whole thing. There was 8 people who dropped out partway through. But that's 20 qualitative questions. Each one had 20 to 100 comments. And then we had 5 open-ended questions, which all 193. And so, you can see in any given response, there's like language of continuation, keep going, pressing on. There's motherhood, there's coaching, there's plateauing, there's desire, there's autonomy or feeling abandoned. So there's so many different kinds of themes. And so this is where we have qualitative coding that can actually help us to do this work. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the qualitative methodology section. But there are a lot of great computer programs that can help us. So we used to have to just use different color highlighters. Like the blue things are about this, and then you had all of the hundreds of papers on the floor, and like, what's blue? This is blue, this is blue. Now we actually have computer programs that can help us to synthesize and to return only the subsets of data that contain particular things. And, can we really isolate one story? The threads are really all connected to each other, but we can tell one story at a time. And is the story that you want to tell really the one that the stakeholders need? And this is something that I have to ask about. And in my dissertation, most of the people were like, they didn't care about my dissertation. Because I was telling the stories that academia was really interested in, and that the field was interested in, but it wasn't the questions that my stakeholders, the organization, was interested in. So the survey and this kind of analysis is a way to actually give back to them stuff that is still interesting and that adds more depth to what I found in my ethnography, or just my experience maybe if I had done this in a school that I was a teacher. I sort of know, because I've been here for 10 years, that this stuff is going on. But what is it? And then, but what do the administrators want to know? What do the teachers themselves want to know? And to be able to tell the stories that they have value in, and in a form that they're literate in. It isn't a journal article. I've had to write up some just reports and some internal policies and to do some trainings. So the product of our research may not be an article per se. It's great if it is, but we have to be open to the product of our research being lots of different genres as well. I'm going to skip ahead to, we'll talk about this a little bit, coding if you want more data. So when we do qualitative data, we can either go from the top, there's something that I know just from my gut is there, and I'm gonna go look for it, but it's also good to go from the bottom up, just to know, okay, I wanted to see what is there, and it may be different than what I'm expecting to be there. And actually you can do kind of both of these things. Qualitative research usually ends up being in a circle. I know I have some questions, I look for the answers to those questions. In the process, I find out those answers, but I also find new questions and keep getting more answers. And so we often end up cycling through. So these kinds of things really transform over time. there's a lot I could say about computer coding, but let me just go to the summary. So qualitative data is really useful, but it can be hard to set boundaries because it's these vast clouds, and this can lead to this, can lead to this. So you have to have a very good research question at the beginning. Choosing which story to tell, what's important to the stakeholders, what's maybe most beneficial to the stakeholders, which they may not feel is very important. What is the most pervasive or the most obvious story in my data set? And what's missing in the research? What fills a gap in terms of what we know? These may be all 4 totally different reasons to tell this particular story, which we find in our data. And doing it well means paying really close attention to how the data is gathered. You have to prepare it very well in a form that everything that needs to be there is there. Coming up with a coding tree, what are the things that I'm actually looking for as I go to this data? Develop everything in collaboration with the stakeholders. So let lots of people look at your question list. Let lots of people look at the codes that you're going to be coding. Look at your questionnaire. Let them also join you in designing it. Pilot everything. Be prepared for surprises. And this last one, kill your puppies. There can be this little pet thing that you discover, like that's the thing that I'm really interested in. That's the thing that I want to know about. But your funding and the interest and other people and the stakeholders, yeah, it's really only you who care about this thing. Like that's the nerdy thing. Like, do that, but maybe not in this paper. Put it aside for a different paper. Find other people who are just as nerdy as you about that one thing, and maybe you can all get together and use that data. So I think that's really important to doing this well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thor. Kill your puppies. So thanks, Thor. So now we're going to hear from our third panelist, Maricel Santos. Ooh, and starting right off with animals.
From dogs to geese. I thought I was going to be at the podium. This makes me feel like we have to sing karaoke. I'm Filipino, so that's natural. Thor, we're going to have to talk later about dogs. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a broader view on research by thinking about the relationship between a project that many of us may define very academically, very traditionally, a thing you have to do for a course requirement or a dissertation or a degree, or whether you are also out in the field, whether you're thinking of it in terms of methods and questions, as we have been talking all morning. A community-based research orientation is going to force us to think about more foundational questions such as, do I feel like a researcher when I'm doing my work? And when you interact with individuals on whom you do stuff to, you collect data from them. You have to access certain schools or programs. Do you feel like a researcher? And is that often accompanied by an uneasiness of how you present yourself to the community? So I want to say very quickly that I spend 30 to 40% of my life in public health. That's not the way I started out in this field. I started out my career in this room with my applied linguistics researcher professor sitting on the corner over there. But having to travel back and forth between public health and TESOL has really forced me to be quite nimble. That's the most optimistic way of thinking about it, of how do you present yourself as an expert in what you know, and how do you invite people into conversations about the puppy you care a lot about. So I'm not going to tell, I'm going to give you a little bit of ambiguity. I'm not going to tell you what this has anything to do with a goose yet, but you're going to learn about that in a couple slides. But the first thing I need to do is define community, because we throw around that word a lot and it's often perceived very differently by people. Again, in public health and in applied linguistics, the sense of community are the folks where the problems they're affected most by a problem. They are not problematic. There is a problem that needs solving. And in my world, it's places where the health disparities are incredible. And language, access to English, access to language services, meaningful language services are huge barriers. And so I, as the applied linguist, often come in to help broaden the conversation about what does it mean to be health literate? What does it mean, or why does health communication need to happen in English? And how quickly can you get from being an ESL classroom to improved health outcomes? So the thing that drives a lot of my work is this assumption that by participating in ESL, that is a risk prevention factor, that is an intervention and this long trajectory to better health outcomes in immigrant communities. If you want to talk about that, I started out work up in Salinas looking at lead poisoning, not a sexy topic, but in fact, there were very disproportionate health disparities around lead poisoning, and the health department was having a hard time reaching out to the community, so they did a community-based move, which is they reached out to ESL teachers as a way to reach out to the target community. If we want to talk about that later, we can talk about it. I have great affection for the teachers that I worked with there. So I'm gonna switch to something that's gonna, this graphic, again, you're gonna get these slides. I just wanted to throw at you, this term of community-based research has so many names depending on the field you begin in, sociology, anthropology, public health, applied linguistics. And there's probably more we can throw up there, but at the core, I think the mother of all of this is something we call CBPR. And there's some wonderful books out there that we can provide you on a bibliography that will enable you to wrap your head around these terms. But again, this idea of what is your connection to community, what is your relationship to community, is a very foundational question for thinking about why are you doing this research in the first place. Okay, this is gonna look familiar to you if you remember an article from 2005 written by our dear colleague, Leo van Leer. And originally, what was on the left-hand side, do you remember? Not social good, the word was content. So Leo was trying to help us understand that when we teach in content-based settings, that there might be this movement between a focus on language versus a focus on content. And points A and B were meant to represent that at any one point in time in your classroom, you may be more language focused. I need you to understand the past tense. And at other points, you were more content focused, which is, I want you to tell a meaningful story about your life, and that gives meaning to the past tense. I look at this more dynamically from the perspective of research. That we can think of those points A's and B's as sticks that stakeholders use. On the one hand, you can think it as very flexible. That at any one point in time in your research, you are gonna have to be focused on the thing you're studying, some aspect of language, some aspect of learning and teaching. At other times, you're gonna be asked to think about what's the social good of your project. Is it doing any good, this focus on language learning and teaching? And you can look at A and B as sort of a healthy, constant shifting of your perspective. And this goes back to that question of when you need to relinquish some sort of hold on your initial research questions, because you may need to think about why you're interested in language learning and teaching in the first place, and what areas of good that actually corresponds to. On a more negative way, sometimes I feel that when we get nervous about the messiness of research, we tend to dig our stakes a little bit tighter into the ground and say, you know what, but I really do know a lot about pedagogical grammar, so I'm gonna stay here. And you allow yourself to not think about different ways that your focus on grammar could be doing good and it's not. So thinking there is a spectrum, there's a shifting, and when we drive those stakes in, these triangles actually move farther apart from each other, which may invite risk that your research is less community relevant than you would want it to be. So I'm gonna walk you through some research missteps. And the first one happened when I was a graduate student here at the Middlebury Institute. In 1994, I was doing a project for Kathy's class where I had just read about matched guise techniques, where you take sort of a single data point and you gauge people's perceptions of it by sort of manipulating the conditions. So I had an essay, and I told some people it was written by an ESL student, and I told some people it was written by a native English speaker. And interestingly, you know, lots of different sociolinguistic perceptions come up. I did what I thought was the right thing to do. I created a small packet, and I walked over to the local community college, and I stuffed faculty mailboxes, inviting them to respond to this perceptual survey. I got an email, or not an email, I got it in the mail because I had given them envelopes. And someone had returned the survey incomplete, and written all over in red was vitriolic critique of me. Who are you? Why are you stuffing this into my mailbox? Why are you encroaching upon my time? I've got lots of other things to do besides grade your paper. Okay, so I'm a graduate student. I did the only thing I could do at 8 o'clock at night. I called Kathy's office. She wasn't there, you were on a trip. So I actually got a hold of another professor, Jean Turner, and I just said, oh my God, I think I screwed up. I didn't put my research out there. And so it's just an example of, I think, where your excitement about a project really misses the mark often about how it's perceived. Who was I? I mean, that was who are you to be asking us these questions? A second one was 4 years later. I was in a doctoral program, and I was in a qualitative data analysis class where we were learning a lot about voice, very inspired by the work of feminist psychologist Carol Gilligan. And what we were asked to do was to interview somebody and listen to voice using a technique called interpretive poetics. And that's similar to like reading poetry, where you look for the layers of meaning. And one way to do it is to listen for the different I's in qualitative data. So I was working in a family literacy program at the time. I was interviewing already, or not interviewing, I was meeting with lots of different learners on a day-to-day basis to help them get their GED, and we were looking and doing narrative writing, personal writing. So it seemed like a natural context to listen to her and see what I could learn more about her as a learner. I remember a moment when I was listening to her, thinking about the analytic tools I had just been given in a course, and thinking, I really better understand this person in this moment. By listening to the layering, I understood her as a learner better. To which at one point she said to me, Maricel, how come every time we meet, I'm reminded that I'm poor and black? And I thought, oh my God, what have I just done to this person? Right, so again, it's another point in my life where I felt like your excitement about a method overtakes the community that you're working with. And so you feel like an interloper, you had the best intentions, but all of a sudden you feel when the sheep clothing comes off that you did more than you had anticipated. The goose approach is different, okay? And this is meant to remind us that the process of doing research is supposed to be with people and not on them. And I'm gonna actually take a little bit of time to just read you a short bit so that you get this goose idea. So you have to know that because geese fly in a V formation, that they actually achieve 71% greater flying range because they work together. That's an important stat. And so this guy named Randy Stoker, I'll give you this resource. It's a great book. He's not in our field, but he's very readable. People who share a common direction and sense of community can get where they are going more quickly and easily because they are traveling on the thrust of one another. And so, I mean, you may know this if you're a birder. When a goose dies or falls out, someone stays behind to make sure the goose is okay, but they also take turns leading. And so this idea of, are you taking turns leading in your research, and does that increase the relevance of the product or the process along the way? I also like to think about goose honking. Do you know why geese honk? They're actually encouraging those up front to keep on going. And so the question for you that Randy Stoker asks as us researchers is, what do we say when we are operating from behind? And I think that's a nice way of thinking about our embeddedness as researchers when we work in community. So here's just a formal definition that I want to leave you with. Again, don't write this down. But the orange reminds you that you always have to be thinking about what you're doing, with whom, and that's why this idea of participant is very important. because you can be a participant because you are the researcher, or you represent an organization like you're the principal at a school, or you're a member of the community. Let's say you are an adult learner and you find yourself in relationship with a researcher from a university. To what end? And again, this definition is from healthcare. What is the purpose behind the data collection? And I understand that the purpose may be to answer a question. This is a much broader, more foundational philosophical orientation. What are you trying to get at? What do you expect this project to be about at the end of the day? I'm going to just tell you a little bit. I'm not going to go into details, but just as an example that I'll keep coming back to. This is a project that I did in the Bay Area where I was working with a day laborer community. And I think just by even saying that, you can understand that the lack of resources in many day laborer centers requires a relationship with a community, with a university, has value because it improves access to resources, but it also requires the university-based researcher to think differently about how you go about doing research. And I don't need to tell this crowd, but I'll say very quickly, the idea around trust around forms makes an IRB process extremely delicate in a day labor situation. Again, during lunch or something, being very clear with your IRB offices that you need to do verbal consent, you don't want to do forms in settings, is something that is community responsive. And you need to be able to articulate that, something I learned the hard way. So Stoker talks about being a goose has 3 elements. That you want to be useful, you want your research to be useful, but you want to be useful to the community while you're doing your research. To employ diverse methods, and I actually don't need to say very much because I think we've seen a lot of what that might look like, and to emphasize collaboration. So just in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about this first one, just to get us started. The focus on being useful, and a key question is, what is the link between the context in which you're collecting the research to the context in which you want to apply your findings? And so one way to think about this is why cross-sectional designs often aren't the best designs if you want to help a local community. And that goes to Thor's question of why surveys. Don't get too excited about surveys, because it tends to try to get the broad spectrum rather than trying to respond to a local interest. And so in the Day Laborer Project, the way we address this is that we tried to be useful even before the project started. So my graduate team and I, we volunteered over several months as ESL teachers. So we had a relationship already before we brought the research project in. We found out that the mobile health van was not coming as regularly to the Day Laborer Center as they wanted. So using just our network with the nursing staff locally and the nurses at the university, we tried to make sure the mobile van was coming more often. And then literally, the nurses on our team were answering the healthcare questions they have. We would come in and want to do a grammar lesson, and they would roll up their sleeves and say, I got cut yesterday. Can you see if that needs? I mean, so again, think about Leo's graph that at any one point, that vantage point on why you're there is going to change, and it's going to be dictated by the people in that community. I'm going to stop there because I think there's lots of other things to talk about being a goose, but thinking mostly, Judy Singer was my statistics professor when I was in a graduate school, and Judy and I realized that we had a connection through her. She used to tell us, you can't fix by analysis what you screw up by design. And I actually think she used a stronger word. She used a stronger word than screw up. But I think you could also say you can't fix by analysis what you didn't invest in by relationship. And said more positively, your analysis is going to be 10 times more valuable if you've invested as much interest and energy into relationships as you did your methodological choices. So I look forward to speaking to more people afterwards in our breakout groups around that, and thank you for all your kind attention.
Wow, that's pretty amazing lineup. So what we're going to do now is have our panelists come up front here, and we're going to have a bit of Q&A. So please, you might take a moment and write some questions. We're going to sit here on chairs. And what we'll do is we might take maybe like 3 or 4 questions before we answer any, right? I think. Okay.
Yeah. Is there a mic down there?
I think Ryan has
Oh,
a
Ryan
mic.
has one. Oh, there's one more up here.
Thanks.
Okay, any questions? So again, we'll take about maybe 3 or 4 questions before we start answering them. Yes? There you go. That's Doreen?
Ryan, how about everybody just say your name and something just like where you work so we can help learning about each other?
Nice, thanks, Beth.
My name is Doreen Ewart, and I teach at the University of San Francisco. Dilemma. Data from students, new students, would be very useful to convince administrators to provide more support for those students. So when I think about the investment in those students from whom I need information, that's the challenge. One, how do I get it? How do they trust me to give me some information about themselves? But it's really, ultimately it does go back to them, and that's often true with the kind of research we do. The people from whom we get our immediate information may not be the beneficiaries of that, but subsequent student groups may be. So that's a dilemma, and I'm not talking here particularly in terms of which method to get the data, but that issue of the relationship with the students with whom I don't know them all, and I need large amounts because basically administrators want to see something in a form that doesn't always lend itself to, or put it this way, the need is greater than the time I feel that I can have in doing a much longer, more ethnographic analysis. So, it's just a dilemma, that many of us live in as administrators of programs.
Absolutely. Okay, how about that? That's a good one. Another question? Comment? We'll take a few. Yes.
Tell us your name.
Okay. My name is Jana, and I work in an EAP pathway program language company as an administrator. And so I don't have a setting within a doctoral program, but I'm very interested in doing some research to try and improve my practice with my teaching staff. And I was wondering if you could give a few pointers on what you think would be the basic tools that I might need to invest in order to start doing some studies with my practice with my teachers, and looking at possibly needing to get some grant funding. What are the basic tools that you need for a study working with different individuals in a teaching program? Might be hard to answer without knowing what I want to study, but the basics.
Okay, great, thanks. How about one more, and then one more question, and then we'll have our panelists address. Yes.
Hi, I'm Teresa Tichikov, and I work at the teacher training program in Oslo, Norway. And from what you're saying, you all collected a lot of data in your research, and that's kind of the overwhelming thought to me in planning. Where do I stop in my planning? How do I focus? Because everyone gives advice, you need to really focus your questions. And then I think, but that leads to that question, and I need this, and I need to do that. And how do you do the pre-planning to make it possible to complete your project?
Wow, great. Okay, well, maybe we'll take one more because Christina's there.
Yeah, just very quickly. I'm Chris.
And this is very, very technical and shows my ignorance because I do not use qualitative coding software. And in fact, I'm not even sure what I do is called coding. My question is, when you code either by hand or by software, isn't that a pattern matching system? And what do you do if there are semantic equivalents in phrases rather than single words or pattern matching, whatever it is your algorithm is designed to find? So I don't know how it works in that way, and so I don't understand how coding can serve our needs completely.
Great. Okay. I think, wow, those are great questions. And Chris, your question might be more suited for our breakout sessions where we talk specifically about some of the methodologies. But so we have three very challenging and excellent questions. One about the dilemma from Doreen about student data and working with administrators and time and investment and relationships. And then Jana asked about where to get started, right? What are the basic tools to get started within her program to do research? And Teresa, yeah, where do you stop? Almost, right? You're collecting a lot of data. So, any of our panelists want to address any of those?
Can I? So for Doreen's question about the fact that the people you gather data from may not be the ones who actually ultimately benefit from it, and that you have to actually convince them that you're worth divulging information to. I can just say from my experience, yeah, the people I gathered data from a dissertation, a lot of them actually ended up having really bad outcomes. And that unfolded over the course of a couple of years. And I remember feeling the ethical dilemma of like, I could intervene. Like there's things I see you're doing which aren't helpful, but I wasn't allowed to like help them at that point, right? Like, and who was I to kind of help them? And so that is a thing. And one of the ways that I actually got data from people was to say, this is going to be too late for you, but I can demonstrate that there's buy-in from higher levels. So the information you give me, it's not just hopefully maybe this will help someone down the line, but I think like if you can actually talk with your administrators ahead of time and make an agreement with them. Yes, I've worked out with the administrators. The administrators themselves are interested in gathering this data so that, and they have said that we can do this and this and this for future students because you participate. Then it's not just like I'm divulging something to you, random researcher, on the off chance that it might help someone. But if you can build that investment or that buy-in from the stakeholders, that the people who actually have the power to make the changes first, that can actually, I think, help persuade people to give you some of their information. And I can respond to the other two questions, but maybe I'll let other people speak as well.
But one of my last slides had some feedback from community organizers, what they want to tell academic researchers. And one of the pieces of advice is use your priestly power for good. And I'm not making up, they said priestly power, and I think it kind of colors how they view that you are in a place of authority, that you have access to resources. And so it's important to be transparent, I think, about what's your capacity to collect new information or to help analyze existing information. And then I think also goes to your question of where do you start. As a director, you probably are obliged to collect data in important ways for programmatic purposes. And so being transparent about that with your teachers, this is what I have to do, and this is how it can be the starting point for something we want to do, is I think exactly what Thor is trying to get out. Just some tiny pieces of advice about where I would start if I were in your situation. The first thing I would do is ask somebody higher up than you for money to pay for food, to bring your teachers together. And that's just code for if you want practitioners to commit to professional development process that's going to take them outside their normal responsibilities. There unfortunately just aren't enough ways in our field to incentivize and reward teachers for this work. We can barely offer honoraria and gift cards to our research participants, and that's something you have to be really creative about. And I've got lots of tips like that. You know, for example, some grants don't allow you to pay for hospitality, and that's where you have to fight back. And you have to say, no, I'm going to squirrel away $250 so I can provide coffee and treats because it matters. It signals that you're interested in meeting with people, not just getting information from them.
Second that. I'm now also the director for the School of Teaching and Learning at the University of Florida, and we had another grant that definitely did not allow for food. And so, but we had like a 10-day institute for teachers. And so we were able, from the grant, pay for an incentive for them to participate. But like, how do you do a 10-day institute without food? You know, you don't send them out and say, go have lunch and come back. And so I realized, you know, as a director, I do have access to some funds. So I go to my dean and say, you know, we need to support. What kind of a budget can we put together? So in fact, 3 different entities put money together. And we said to the project coordinator, here's the budget. Go figure out 10 days worth of lunches. And she did. She did. She worked with different restaurants in the community. I think what's really interesting here is this notion of stakeholder, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that in terms of what kind of, if one of the goals is to convince certain stakeholders to change practices, I think we need to be really aware of what kind of research do we need to do that will speak to them. It's not always the research that we might want to do. The poor puppy. But it might be way more effective. And so going back to our Project Delta, you know, we were really fascinated by the practices of the teachers. The funding agency and everybody else is like, where's the quantitative data? How did you show impact through those means? And so we found we were always kind of balancing it out. Well, yes, we're going to show those data, but let us also tell the other story that we get from the other data. So we kept kind of insisting on that, but we knew what mattered for a lot of the audiences that we talked to were those quantitative pieces. And so kind of thinking through where you want to accomplish change, what kind of different kinds of research will help kind of move that needle on that issue, I think is really important to think about. Different questions, different methodologies.
I just wanted to add one thing about the time question, like when do you know you're done? Another piece of advice the organizer wanted to give researchers was be quick about what you want to do. And that to me is, our timeline is an artifact of research. You know, the timeline that you have 18 months to get, or 4 years to get to a dissertation, those are artifacts of a research process that's determined by some other entity. Communities understand when a project is over because, well, in my case, they feel better. They have access. Their children are in better healthcare situations. There are other metrics that determine the project is over. And I think what's a wonderful community galvanizing activity is to put everybody's timeline up for analysis and to say, where are you in all of this? And I think it enables you to communicate to IRB offices why you need to have midpoint checks of, are these the right methods I'm using to be able to answer the questions I have, rather than saying, I know exactly all the methods I'm going to use for this 18-month duration.
To address maybe Teresa's question about having a focused question, but also having a lot of data. In some ways, when you're doing data collection, it takes a lot to get out and sitting in front of people face to face or to have documents. So grab what you can, but that doesn't mean that you have to analyze everything or ask anything. Like, you may still just ask one question. Like, you may not be interested at all in motherhood, but you're grabbing a lot of data that ends up involving a lot of people talking about language learning and motherhood, but it's like, maybe I'll come back to that in 5 years, maybe I won't. But grab the data while you can, once you have the permissions and you've gotten everything there, but you can still, and I think that's important, like about which story you're looking at. And the one thing that I like about sort of coding, and it is still a human process, it's not the computer that parses the text and makes the decision, it's the human who decides what different things are. And then the computer just helps us to organize it and to keep track of it. And I might say, you know, spending $11 a month for a good a coding thing to help you organize the research process might actually be a good tool to invest in. But I think you can still tell a very focused story in a lot of data, and you can even just set data aside for a while. You don't have to use all of it for the study that you have, but it may be something that's worth doing later. And then including in that, maybe in your permission, is it okay if I contact you a year later for a follow-up interview? And if they give you permission then, you may discover there's some things later that you actually need to follow up on. And if you've built that in to that initial data collection, that you could get future data and the contact information through which you can do that, that might be helpful.
And I also think that, just to add to that, if you're a classroom teacher wanting to do like research in your own classroom, I think thinking through what data sources you already have access to kind of naturally as a starting point also really helps. You don't always have to create a new survey, a new, but even just videotaping yourself or whatever it is that you're interested in. I think using what's right there is a good starting point. And I think the data matrix, that question of who do you go to kind of provide some of the information, I think is a great starting point, because sometimes the data is already collected. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you, all of our panelists. I can tell this is not the end of a conversation. It really is the beginning of a conversation.